Hello and welcome to the SecurityDNA podcast produced by SecurityInfoWatch.com. I'm Samantha Schober, Assistant Editor of SecurityInfoWatch and the producer of today's podcast. SecurityInfoWatch is your go-to resource for cutting-edge insights that matter most to today's security and risk professionals. We bring you sharp, up-to-the-minute analysis of industry trends, emerging threats, and the latest technology that impacts your world. Our expert coverage goes beyond headlines, offering real-world strategies, innovative solutions, and critical risk intelligence to keep you ahead of the curve. From policy updates to breakthrough tools, we cut through the noise to deliver actionable information that empowers you to make smart, informed decisions in this dynamic security landscape. My colleague, Steve Lasky, a veteran of more than 3 decades in the security industry, has joined me as host for this episode. As the editorial director for the security group at Endeavor Business Media, Steve's unique perspective, wealth of knowledge, and extensive experience in this sector make him an invaluable contributor to our discussions. Today, Steve invited Mark Freedman to join the SecurityDNA conversation. Mark Freedman is the principal and CEO of Rebel Global Security, a leading advisory firm specializing in national security, geopolitical strategy, and risk management for critical infrastructure companies. Known for his expertise and trusted counsel, Mark equips executives with actionable strategies to navigate today's complex security landscape. Before founding Rebel, Mark honed his expertise at Deloitte Consulting and Accelerate Solutions, advising the Department of Defense, FBI, and U.S. intelligence community on national security policy, great power competition, and critical infrastructure resilience. Mark's nearly decade-long tenure as a U.S. State Department officer included serving as Chief of Staff to the Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism, overseeing operations for a 150-member bureau managing over $1 billion in foreign assistance funds. He led initiatives to enhance European security after the 2015 Paris ISIS attacks, curb weapons proliferation during the Arab Spring, and establish innovative forums for multilateral security collaboration. Mark holds a master's in security studies from Georgetown University and a bachelor's in international affairs from the George Washington University. A certified production professional and certified information security manager, he contributes to AS's steering committees on enterprise security risk management and critical infrastructure. And with that, let's turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Samantha. Much appreciated. Mark, nice to see you again.
You too, Steve. Good to be back.
Great. It's always a pleasure to get you back. Just going through the CV, if we didn't know you, I couldn't think of someone more astute to join us on this conversation today. You've worked with us on Security Technology Executive Magazine, on SIW, and you bring some really unique perspectives to the mounting terrorism threats in the U.S. and in corporate America, which is something I think we sort of forget sometimes. And, going through the litany of recent events here, you're looking at the New Orleans truck terror attack, the explosion of a Tesla at Trump's hotel, and the targeted murder of a healthcare executive. And they all underscore a troubling evolution in the domestic and corporate terrorism landscape, I think. While these events appear disparate, they reveal critical synergies that warrant closer analysis. First, the New Orleans attack reflects the enduring appeal of vehicle ramming, a low-cost, high-impact tactic popularized by extremist groups, but increasingly used by lone wolf actors. This method's accessibility suggests a persistent vulnerability in public spaces and soft targets, whereas the Tesla explosion at Trump's hotel demonstrates a potential pivot towards symbolic corporate and political venues, which will leverage emerging technologies like electric vehicles as weapons. Such incidents signify that the blending of ideological and operational sophistications, likely motivated by broader political polarization and personal grievances, are things that now we need to be on the alert for. And the murder of a healthcare executive highlights a concerning rise in targeted violence against leaders in critical infrastructures. Whether ideologically or economically driven, such acts destabilize organizational operations and exacerbate risks in sectors like healthcare, which are already under strain. Taken together, these incidents reflect a diversification of motivations and methods in domestic terrorism, a growing intersection between ideological and corporate targets. They highlight the necessity for robust threat intelligence, enhanced security protocols, and interdisciplinary collaboration between the public and private sectors. And these trends suggest that the U.S. may be facing an expansion of domestic and corporate terrorism, with perpetrators exploiting both societal divisions and technological advancements to target symbolic, vulnerable, and high-value entities. So, Mark, let's dive in right here. And you and I have talked before we got on air, and we sort of divided up this discussion into some major categories. And the first one I think we want to hit is the threat of jihadists and religious terrorists, and looking at the destabilization in the Middle East, a new administration coming in the U.S. who right now is sort of a wild card on how they view Middle East politics and Ukraine and other hotspots around the world. How is the evolving global jihadist networks influencing the radicalization and operational capabilities of domestic actors in the U.S., mainly through encrypted communication platforms, which we saw on two of the last events, and through social media? And what strategies can law enforcement and intelligence agencies employ to counter the influence of this growing social media and communication platforms and not lose our civil liberties and privacy?
Well, thanks, Steve. Again, thanks for having me back, and good to be with you to discuss all these issues. So, starting with jihadist terrorism, and I think it's probably best to just jump off from the New Orleans New Year's Day attack. In a lot of ways, that attack could have happened 8 years ago, 10 years ago. It has kind of all the hallmarks of what we saw from ISIS-inspired attacks at the time, in the mid-2010s, when ISIS still was operating out of its so-called caliphate in Syria and Iraq. You have in the attacker, Shamsuddin Jabbar, an individual who's an American citizen, was, as far as we can tell, radicalized remotely with no direct contact with ISIS operatives either in the Middle East, Africa, or elsewhere, but really was just an individual who ingested the radicalizing propaganda content that ISIS put out there, the intent of causing something like this to happen. I mean, this is why ISIS adopted that kind of media-based approach again a decade ago, and it obviously continues to pay dividends for them. You have in Jabbar an individual who, as is the case with so many of these individuals, and we can talk about the others who were involved in the Las Vegas incident and the United Healthcare murder, but with all of these individuals, you see a confluence of factors that come into play. We can get into it later, I think, but mental health factors, financial stressors, interpersonal relationship stressors, but then the terrorist angle becomes an activator or a catalyst, or it gives them purpose or meaning, and it results in this sort of destruction. So that's all to say, when we look at the jihadist threat environment, and particularly at the New Orleans attack, in that particular incident, there's not a lot new there. That is as far as I see it, kind of the ongoing threat that we've seen for 10 years. And when you look at methodologies and what we call TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, vehicle ramming was quite popular with jihadist-inspired assailants in the mid-2010s. Now, that's not to say that nothing is changing or evolving in the jihadist threat environment. The main thing that has changed within the last couple of years is the October 7th attacks in Israel and the fallout from those attacks, the Israeli Hamas war, and which we may be at in the first couple days of ceasefire as we record and kind of go to press on this. But that has really shifted the global threat environment when it comes to jihadist terrorism, because whenever you have these conflicts, and we can go back through history, right? We can look at the Syria war, the Iraq war, the Afghanistan war. These conflicts have also a catalyzing effect where people who may not have been radicalized otherwise, they start to see content. They start to see news. They start to see, to your point about social media, content and images fed to them through the algorithm. And that can have just a radicalizing effect over time. And so, you may have individuals in the United States or Europe who've never traveled to the Middle East, who've never had any contact with, real kind of, when I say real terrorists, I mean like terrorists who are part of the rank and file, right? Part of the corporate structure, so to
Right.
speak, of an ISIS. But they ingest that content about, dead kids in Gaza or about Israeli airstrikes, and it makes them angry and it makes them upset. And then it maybe coalesces with other personal stresses that they have. And then they kind of go down the rabbit hole, whether that's Hamas propaganda or ISIS propaganda or related. And it can result in these attacks, which are very, very difficult to pick up because if you're going down the radicalization rabbit hole alone, it's very difficult for law enforcement to pick that up. The way that we can pick things up is by picking up communications. You're engaging with somebody, you get sloppy. But if you're doing it all on your own, what we has called for many years lone wolf terrorism, it's very difficult to do anything about that. And we can get into it more later, but the environment, the social media environment, as it relates to potential radicalization, I unfortunately have, my outlook is negative on that in terms of the ability to bring that under control.
Yeah, I don't see how it's going to get better because, now you have billionaires controlling social media and national newspapers who pretty much, with the new administration coming in, saying it's a total hands-off environment. Free open space, free speech will win out. We're not going to put any barriers on hate speech or misinformation. So again, this only exacerbates what's happening. And you look at some of the experts who are now saying that for every Hamas or Hezbollah terrorist that was killed in the recent conflict, another 3 joined up to take their place. Whether that's an accurate number, is unverifiable. But the bare truth is that when you have an indoctrinated ideology, it's hard to infiltrate that with logic and facts. So that's unfortunate, and we're seeing this here in the United States with our right wing and Christian nationalism, extremism, and for me, it's also disconcerting for being grown up in a military family to see that both of the events that took place recently in Las Vegas, the Tesla bomber, these were both military veterans. So what kind of specific socio-political factors are driving the rise of right-wing and Christian nationalist terrorism in the U.S. that seems to be influencing young military folks as well? And how are these groups leveraging mainstream political narratives to expand their influence and operational reach?
Well, I want to be careful, particularly on the Las Vegas incident. I think there was a lot at play in that one. Clearly, some PTSD, some mental
Correct.
health issues,
Correct.
and so I don't know how to label that. I think the Bureau is still kind of doing some work around that.
Sure.
And you may have just had a very kind of unfortunate and tragic incident that was, frankly, more like, a military suicide, but conducted in such a way that it certainly had the hallmarks of a terrorist incident and may inspire other terrorist incidents due to its methodology and tactics, more so than whatever the intent of the individual involved was. With regard to right-wing terrorism, we're in a really interesting political environment with that. And it is truly hard to disentangle all of the different causal factors at play. I will say that, from kind of a textbook perspective, if we were talking about this in a grad school class on terrorism, there would be some discussion about the fact that if you look at when terrorism tends to spike, it's correlated with legitimate pathways to political expression being shut down, at least in some cases, if not in most. And so you have to balance that against the fact that the rise of a mainstream right-wing populism in this country has seemed to have an emboldening effect on some right-wing extremists. Now, what's interesting, I think, is when we talk about that legitimate pathways being shut down, look at January 6th, right? Trump lost that election against President Biden, and therefore there was potentially a feeling of existential threat to some of those really hardline groups that showed up as part of the crowd at the Capitol. And so, as they're seeing that legitimate political expression get shut down, a Trump loss, you're seeing violence break out, right? So I think it remains to be seen in a Trump 2.0, which we're about to start at the time of recording, right? We're a couple days out from inauguration. I think it's going to be interesting to see, does a Trump presidency create an environment where right-wing extremists who think they're aligned with him. Now, I mean, I don't put Trump's personal views and his motives and whatever aside. They see they think that they see an ally in him. They've constructed this view. And so they may be emboldened, but they also may not feel the same level of existential threat that they felt under a Biden administration, where it seems that progressive liberal values are on the march, right? So that, I think, is just an interesting kind of broader political environment to watch, and we'll have to see. I mean, I to be honest, Steve, I can't sit here and give you a strong prediction on my end about, are we going to see a big spike in right-wing terrorism in the United States or not over the next 4 years. I think it depends on how these groups, which have perverse worldviews, interpret the events around them. And we'll have to see. The other thing that I'll note on right-wing terrorism is this gets so politicized, where it is assumed, well, and look, there are legitimate areas of concern around what Trump has said or Trump hasn't said, especially during the first administration. But looking at right-wing terrorists, both in the United States and globally, I believe has become pretty much a bipartisan priority. A lot of the work that is focused on the global threat from what they call RIMV is the acronym, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, that began under the first Trump administration.
Yep.
and continued under the Biden administration. And we saw the State Department designation foreign terrorist organization of Terrorgram earlier this week, which is kind of a global social media network that has advocated for, inspired, facilitated far-right terrorism around the world. So I think you're seeing actually the culmination of some work on that, whereas prior to, say, 2018, 2019, there was really an exclusive focus on jihadist terrorism.
Right. And you're also seeing, I mean, a shift, I think, globally towards more right-leaning and harsher outlooks at the political scene. I mean, you saw Le Pen in France. You got this fascist neo-Nazi growing movement in Germany, in Austria, in South America. There have been issues, and all of these kind of following that Trump playbook and the Maduro playbook and others, where misinformation and sort of keeping the fringe elements satiated with red meat is something that we've got to look out for. But let's not give the right wing the exclusivity on what's happening here as well. We're looking at left wing and anarchist, anti-corporate threats now that are growing too. We saw that with the shooting of the UMR, United Health CEO. How can corporations and security agencies effectively identify and counter this rising threat from anarchists and this kind of left-wing radical anti-corporate fringe who are operating in decentralized networks and have adopted sophisticated low visibility tactics. I mean, there's got to be vulnerabilities that these actors exploit. What are they, and how can businesses, man that threat?
This is an area that I'm really concerned about. The rise of violent far left terrorism in this country and elsewhere. There are a few reasons I'm concerned about it. One is, and potentially the main reason, is that I think we in this country, and when I say we, I think the public and counterterrorism authorities and most parts of the government kind of have their minds wrapped around the threat from jihadist terrorism and
Right.
far right terrorism. We've been dealing with that for a pretty long time in this country with pretty recent historical reference points. Obviously, jihadist terrorism, right? Don't need to kind of cover that ground again. But on the far right side, we've seen things as recently as January 6th and that sort of violent activity. But you also go back to Oklahoma City, right? There's kind of a well-trod path here for understanding the contours of that threat. When it comes to left-wing terrorism, there's really not a lot of recent historical precedent in this country. You have to go back, though, to the early 20th century with the anarchist bombings, and then more recently in the late 20th century with ELF and ALF terrorism, the Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front, which our view has become skewed by 9/11. But it's important to remember that in the 90s, ELF and ALF were considered the top terrorist threat to the
Right.
country by the FBI. And they weren't running around killing people. For the most part, they were engaged in arson, property destruction, and actually tried to really consciously avoid human casualties as a result of their acts. But I think what you're seeing with the murder of Brian Thompson in December is a boiling over of extreme far left views into violence. And to me, that's a bit of a scary thought, because we've thought that the left wing, maybe by virtue of some of the other political views and ideologies that we associate with the left side of the political spectrum in this country, like for example, gun control, right? That we've said it's just not going to get that violent, right? Maybe some property destruction, maybe some vandalism, but there's not going to be an intent to kill. But that changed, right? I mean, we saw that in December. And what's more concerning than the event itself is the reaction that we've seen. The widespread condoning of Luigi Mangione's assassination of Brian Thompson.
Yeah, that was the most incredible thing. I mean, you had cottage industry setting up, producing hats and T-shirts supporting this guy. I mean, I think we're looking at, again, and we keep talking about social media and other outlets that are just ripe with misinformation, that we are emboldening people like this because it's like a prophecy that we're going to play out with this class warfare that we're putting forth now, both in politics and with among other pundits, that the oligarchy that we're looking at. We keep hearing this now with, on Monday, you're going to have Gates, Musk, Zuckerberg, the CEO from TikTok, for goodness sakes, up on the dais as Trump gets sworn in. I mean, this is the unholy triumvirate of billionaires. And I think people like Mangione and other folks that are really bringing this class warfare grievance to task look at this and just say that something that we need to address violently. And I just, you look at it, Mark, and I don't know how you assess that.
Well, I think, Steve, you made an interesting point there, which is you see what happens in the mainstream political environment, right? There's a relationship between Trump and Musk, right? And there's there's obviously he's a billionaire, he has billionaire friends, right? Okay, well, that's the way that it is, right? That
Right.
doesn't mean that they should be killed, right? Then on the other side, in the mainstream political environment, closing message of the Democratic campaign in late October, early November, this guy's a threat to democracy. Okay, so that's part of the mainstream political environment. So that in the mainstream political environment in this country, you have things that are concerning, statements that are made really kind of across the board. And then what happens is it goes into the ether, and that ether can be the social media environment or the, deranged journaling of somebody who's about to go commit an assassination. But it goes into this kind of interpretation environment where it's not that difficult to see the leap, right? What you're describing about it. So you have all of this election language around if Trump wins, it's going to be the last election that we ever have in this country, right? You have mainstream Democrats saying that, whether they believe it or not, whether it's true or not, whatever, they're saying that, right? And then you see Trump and Musk, and you see that the way that people are freaking out about it. And so you can see how an individual would feel that they have license to go and take the law into their own hands, right? Because we've created this political environment where it's sort of like anything goes and you can
And,
say
and
anything.
it sort of and it balances out your other statement about January 6th, where you had, this fringe element that felt disenfranchised and helpless because their candidate lost, and that they wanted to get that point across. And we're seeing that it's the exact same correlation, just on either end of the spectrum, and they're
Right.
both destructive.
Right. And I think that we've now to go back to the point about the experience that we have, it's been kind of accepted in the mainstream that we've got this right-wing terrorism threat.
Sure.
And I think there is a bit of an orthodoxy in this country and in Washington that the right wing is going to get violent and is prone to violence and the left wing won't, right? And that concerns me because that sort of orthodoxical thinking where you're just like, yeah, this is the right wing, they have a long history of militia violence, and so they're going to be violent. The left wing, they're not going to do anything. They're just going to go protest and whatever. That's dangerous thinking because you're not going to be open to a rapidly shifting environment where methodologies are changing, tactics are changing. And the one other thing I'll throw in here regarding what we're seeing from the far left, which is just, I mean, is fascinating to me from from the perspective of somebody who has studied terrorism for many years, is the convergence of individuals who protest in favor of Luigi Mangione against United Healthcare and also are walking around with Hamas flags and Hezbollah flags, right? And we know we see that there is crossover between those causes. We see some of the symbolism show up at multiple rallies that are associated with those causes. And there are a couple of things that are concerning about that. Obviously, first and foremost is the, sympathy for designated foreign terrorist organizations.
Sure.
But on a deeper level, what's concerning is the ignorance, the deep ignorance that, you are out here protesting against the healthcare system in this country and also feeling that you can understand Hamas's perspective. Hamas is the most conservative of the conservative, right? They don't share any sympathy with the kind of causes that would be adopted by the far left in this country. So if that kind of ignorance and black and white thinking and pushing your own worldview onto the world as it is so dangerous because it means that the ability to learn and understand has gone out the window.
And that's to me that's the most frustrating thing that we have going. I mean, first of all, Israel needs a better PR firm to get their message out. But when you look at the inbred radicalization of people on the West Bank, people in Gaza, I mean, it's understandable. I mean, it's an indoctrination from birth. And when your mantra is that you're going to kill all the Jews and you're going to push Israel into the sea, doesn't leave a lot of open ground for discussion. But like you said, we're both upper level college educated people, and when you see students at Ivy League schools just going hell bent with Hamas and Hezbollah headgear and talking about the virtues of freedom fighters versus terrorists. There's a big difference between what Haganah was back in the day when Israel was starting. They were a terrorist organization deemed by the British and others, but there's an understanding of history, of ideology that needs to be taught, that's not being taught. And again, it's because, of social media and mainstream media, corporate media, where you get caught in these bubbles and you can't punch your way out, and it leads to bad endings. And so I kind of want to jump to this. This is going to be our last topic of discussion. We're sort of running out of time. When we look at conspiracy theory, which is part of that, that world of unintelligible strategies where people bring out the strangest theories, such as QAnon and the election denialism, pandemic misinformation that was very dangerous. And they transform from online narratives into real world motivations for terror attacks and organized group actions. So are there any effective interventions that we're going to be able to counter the spread of conspiracy theories and that psychological grip they get on individuals that are going to risk engaging in violence? And there's again, it's a conundrum. And when you deal with conspiracy theories, again, you're dealing with social media and misinformation in mainstream media.
I could offer you some thoughts on strategies, but to be honest, Steve, I'm just pretty bearish on the ability for them to make a dent. So when I was at the State Department, a large part of the programming that we did was designed to prevent radicalization or to de-radicalize individuals. This was obviously focused overseas rather than here at home, but that was a big part of the discussion and a big part of what we were trying to do. It can work. It is really, really, really tough. That is because these individuals, whether they are going down the path of radicalization or have already become radicalized and engaged in terrorist activity, they are buying into a black and white worldview. And as we talked about at the top of the pod, it's informed and it's pushed forward by their own personal experiences, their financial stress, their personal stress, the fact that they never achieved what they wanted to achieve in life. And this is a way to, make some meaning and make some purpose. So it really gets into the psychology, and I'm not a psychologist, so
Right.
I'm not gonna get into that. But I can tell you just from my experience, it's really hard to do it both at the individual level and at a societal level. With our environment in this country, particularly the political environment and how charged that is, and how much there is an othering going on both sides, right?
Right.
Absolutely on both sides, where there is just an inability to come to the table, meet in the middle, try to understand, try to learn. That has really gone out the window, right? So we're in a political environment where there's a one against the other side going on. And then you have the social media element, which I think is, we used to think that social media was sort of a corollary factor or something that kind of exacerbated existing things. I really think at this point we have to accept that the social media environment is a fundamental factor. It is a key part of the mix that's going on here, where that creates an environment as people increasingly move out of physical spaces and into virtual spaces, where what goes into their mind every day is determined by the algorithm rather than where they happen to go, where they work, where they study, where they sleep, that we are in an environment that has become highly conducive to the development of conspiracy theories and to conspiratorial views. And part of this is that ignorance piece, right? You can be, I mean, Steve, have you ever sat in front of Facebook and Instagram for 10 minutes and then after those 10 minutes you feel stupider than you did 10 minutes ago, right? That's how
routinely.
Yeah, right. That's how I feel, certainly, right? And so I can have my degrees and my education and whatever. I guarantee you I'm getting stupider being on that thing, right?
And the thing is, too, you're looking at the CEOs that control these very powerful mediums and platforms have taken off the guardrails. So basically they have said, hey, it's open season on stupidity, open season on conspiracies. Hey, throw you in the gladiator pit and see who comes out. The Christians or the lions.
And there's not an incentive for them to do otherwise. There hasn't been meaningful legislation. There hasn't been meaningful regulation. And to them, they got other priorities. This is their businesses. So
making money for shareholders.
It's on government to do this. I mean, I'm a firm believer, as somebody who's worked both government and private sector. If you want something done on this, you can't say, oh, it's those social media companies don't care about what. I mean, whatever. They're a company. That's showbiz, baby, right? I mean, you have to look to government to do something meaningful. Just like they did with the financial services sector, right? There are all sorts of laws and regulations in place to address terrorist financing and money laundering in the financial sector. It's a huge headache for the banks, but they do it because they got to do it. They wouldn't do it of their own volition.
Yeah, and the scary part is too we're entering an environment that some of these crucial compliance and regulatory statutes are maybe going by the board, and that's going to be even more frightening for me. So I think we need to leave it there. I mean, you and I could go on for, we had 3 or 4 or 5 questions we had to leave out, but I think we got a great discussion. And so I want to thank you for your time and your expertise. And these are all critical issues. It's going to be interesting to see how they play out over the next 4 years or so. We have got an overreaching feeling of entitlement and intolerance that appears to be reaching a crescendo here, both in politics, business, and on our social order. So I'm hoping we're going to find a vacuum where everything is going to come back towards the middle a little bit here. So again, thanks a lot. We will have you back again. I'm sure we're going to have some things over the next several months that are going to warrant your expertise as well. So Mark, appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Great. So Sam, I'm going to toss it back to you to close us out.
Well, Steve and Mark, thank you for this extremely compelling conversation about the threats and challenges of rising terrorism in the U.S. and around the globe. And thank you for tuning in. This podcast is your go-to source for staying ahead in the security industry, offering sharp insights, real-time threats, and straight talk for industry professionals. It's built for you to stay informed and empowered wherever you are. Stay connected, stay sharp, and keep security front and center. To access our podcast lineup, go to podbean.com and search for SecurityDNA. You can also find our podcast in our Security Frontline, Integrator Newswire, and Security Week e-newsletters. Of course, we'd love to get feedback from you, our listeners, about topics they're interested in. If you have a suggestion, email Steve at slasky, that's SLASKY, at SecurityInfoWatch.com. This episode of the SecurityDNA podcast was recorded and produced by Samantha Schober, that's me, Assistant Editor for Security InfoWatch. For Steve Lasky, Mark Freedman, and everyone at Security InfoWatch, thanks for listening and keep an ear open for our next podcast.